Hi, and welcome to Real Men of Real Estate. I am your host, Brian Fox, and today we've got a great episode for you talking about all things law and real estate, specifically how the law does interact with real estate, but also how you mitigate risk in all the different kinds of investments you'll do in the real estate industry. We've got a great panel today as well as a great guest. I'm going to introduce them one by one. To my right is Stephen Matley, who is the president of Coast to Coast Equities. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you, Brian. Good to be here again.
Wonderful. And to his right is Tunde Ogunwole, who is our commercial development manager. Welcome, Tunde.
It's good to be back.
And to his right is Robert Radulescu, who is the founding attorney for Romancore Real Estate and Romancore Law. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Okay, so today we're going to get into it. We're going to talk a lot about the risk of real estate, how we mitigate it. You know, a lot of things have come up in my life and my career where you really need to focus in on how to make sure you don't have the problems. So jumping into that, it doesn't matter how we start this, but I want to talk about the different segments of real estate. So there's the buy and hold, there's the long-term damage of a fix and flip and what you have to take as the builder and the warranty you have to give out on that. So many different things. So starting out, let's talk about landlord-tenant law. So from your perspective, really quickly, how does the interaction between landlord and tenant, the buy and holds for most investors, if they're deciding to go that route with their investment portfolio, how do they protect themselves? How does the landlord protect themselves in that long-term security of that asset?
That's a great question. So I think first of all, what people have to keep in mind is when you're talking about landlord and tenant law, there are three separate elements. There are issues that may come up pre-negotiation, like when basically a landlord tries to rent out a unit or a house or a complex, whatever it is. There are pre-negotiation laws that apply. Then there are, once the tenancy was created, there are things that can arise during that tenancy. And then lastly, there are things that can arise after the tenancy was created. And that's a lot of times when most lawsuits occur, most things that can go bad will go bad towards the end. But to begin with, the most important things are for any sort of landlord to protect themselves are not to commit any type of things that can get them into trouble as far as discrimination, you know. So when you're advertising for a rental unit that you want to put on the market, do not do things like discriminate against any of the protected classes. There's a whole laundry list of things, but among others, it's race, national origin, gender, sexual orientation, a whole list of other things. Or you cannot do things such as treat these tenants differently based on one of these protected classes that the law recognizes. Before you even get into the whole tenancy aspect of things, you have to recognize what sort of tenancy you have. Do you have a residential or do you have a commercial tenancy? A lot of our most stringent laws apply for residential tenancies. So once you're renting out to a commercial piece of property, you're a lot more free to negotiate and to include clauses and to do basically work up your rental however you want. But those same things cannot happen on the residential side because the law protects a lot more the residential tenants than it does commercial tenants. So first you have to sort of see what your target is.
Yeah. So, and Tony, I saw you nod your head quite a bit. Obviously, we know you guys develop stuff and then you get it rented out. So how does that overlap with your stuff?
Well, I was going to say that definitely seems pretty accurate in terms of the relationship and the commercial lease negotiations. It's highly collaborative. Or negotiate. I shouldn't necessarily say it's collaborative, but there's definitely an opportunity for going back and forth in terms of terms. I think locking in what the provisions are when the tenant moves out and what they're obligated to perform or what the landlord's obligated to perform on the back end of the deal, that's pretty important. So yeah, I definitely would agree that I think there seems to be a wide degree of variability, and having the right legal counsel to help us with some of those terms is critical.
Question for you, Robert. You mentioned the protected classes, civil rights. How does ADA fit into that? Obviously on commercial there's a lot of issues, but on residential, is there an obligation?
It really depends on a few different factors, So for example, it depends on when was the building constructed, There are certain regulations that come into new developments, But when you have older developments that are not touched, then you don't have to worry about the ADA compliance as you do on the commercial side of things. Or, for example, like when I actually have seen cases where people go in and some of the only thing that they do is they're disabled and they are using a wheelchair or something, and they are going from business to business essentially, and they're just finding new businesses that have not complied with the new ADA regulations, and they're suing them. And it's unethical, sometimes for some of these attorneys that they know that that's their bread and butter. Sometimes some attorneys take on these cases and they have tons of lawsuits using the same exact client where they just sue businesses. That's their entire occupation.
Yeah, there's predatory lawsuits
exactly.
out there. But I was actually looking more like as an individual. Let's say I want to rent a house out. I'm a landlord, right? So as a landlord, let's say I have someone that wants to move in and they are disabled, they have a wheelchair, and all they need is me to take like all the doors off inside or something in order to get wheelchairs through. Am I obligated to do that at all? Is that a reasonable accommodation, or can I rent to someone else and not be guilty of discrimination?
If it's just a the law varies from up to 4 units and then from 4 and above. If it's up to 4, you don't have to accommodate for those things. If it's for more than 4 units, sometimes you have to start making those accommodations. So
and you use the term reasonable accommodation. Is that kind of the
exactly? So exactly. A lot in law has to do with the term reasonable, and there's been hundreds of years of litigation to sort of define what's reasonable is in different contexts of the law and in different areas of the law. Obviously, no one's going to force someone to tear down the building or the structure to accommodate for
taking down doors in a multifamily more than 5 units or something. That seems like a reasonable accommodation.
Exactly.
So then I have a question for you then. So, we deep dove into that kind of segment, but most of the stuff that comes up for me in my business is landlord tenant related. It's a lot to do with vagueness, right? There's room for what reasonable is, I guess. It's not really very well outlined. If I was a landlord and I'm dealing with a tenant, one of the things I've seen is they know how to stay in the property longer than they're supposed to.
Right.
Can you just kind of talk about?
I see a lot.
Yeah, talk about that real quick, because when I'm dealing with people who want to invest, that is their main concern.
Right.
Well, let's say that's their nightmare. Is it somebody? What if I get one of those people? And so we apply a 25% vacancy rate to everything for the time that people aren't in the property. But how do you just talk about that for like a moment? Like, how would you advise someone that's their fear?
Honestly, once you start dealing with the legalities of how to kick someone out, you're already sort of you've already lost from a lot of standpoints, because to deal with that, you have to hire an attorney. You have to spend a lot of money on trying to deal with kicking that tenant out. So the best way to avoid that is obviously to screen your tenants, to filter out the bad tenants from the good tenants. And obviously a lot of that has to do with having a face-to-face interaction with your tenants, with doing a background check on them. There's a lot of services out there that allow landlords to go ahead and contract with them, and they do employment checks, they do background checks on these tenants. Obviously, as a landlord, it's your duty to, investigate. Like, who are you going to rent your unit to? Call up their place of employment. Are they a reputable individual? Are they someone that you should feel comfortable as a landlord to rent to? When you're already that far advanced where things are starting to go wrong and they're not paying you your rent, or they're sort of like a trouble tenant for a number of different things, then what you have to do is you have to file an unlawful detainer action. And the courts and the laws look down upon what's called self-help, where some landlords, they've done this in the past. They go in, they change the locks, to a unit, they're like, put the stuff out on the curb, okay, you're out of here. So obviously the courts look very down upon things like that. So that's why the courts have forbidden landlords from employing those tactics. So what the landlords have to do is they have to file unlawful detainer actions, and you're right. Sometimes some tenants, they have gone around to sort of combat that, because even after it goes to court, and even after it gives the landlord, let's say, they've won on that. There's some tricks.
What I'm going to do, not to stop you because I want to get into this, but we're going to continue on that. We're going to take a real quick commercial break. We'll be right back. We're going to continue on this subject and back into all the other sides of legal. Thanks.
If you love them enough to relearn math so you can teach them math, then surely you'll check nhtsa.gov/the right seat to make sure they're correctly buckled in the back seat.
You made your house a reality. Homeschooling yourself on loans, color-coding listings, and flushing every toilet in a 20-mile radius. If you can ace house hunting, you can do it for retirement. Get on track with tips at aceyourretirement.org.
Hi, and welcome back to Real Men of Real Estate. We just took a quick break, but we're back to talking about landlord-tenant law and all things legal when it comes to real estate. And we stopped talking about how to protect yourself against a tenant who decides they're going to stay in the property for longer than they're supposed to, maybe go against the agreement. We're talking about pre-screening. Let's jump back into pre-screening. What are the ways that we can protect ourselves as investors?
So, as I mentioned, a lot of different things you can do as far as, and first of all, just sort of like a word of caution. None of this stuff can be a surefire way to guarantee.
It's not a magic pill.
Of course. There's always going to be circumstances that change in any sort of tenant, and you may have a perfect tenant, and then turns out that years down the road or months down the road, they turn into someone that you don't want to rent to anymore because they're not paying their bills, or they start causing all these issues that affect the rest of your tenants, and people just don't want to have them around. But you can't really screen for those. The most you can do is screen for background, as far as credit, as far as employment, as far as who are they, and what are they productive members of society? Do you want that tenant to rent from you? Do you want that tenant to be a part of your whatever, whether it's a house or whether it's a complex? Do you want that tenant to be part of your community?
Yeah, and so good point. And I have a question on that. So Steve, on break, you were talking about a situation where on the screening, the person was pedigree. They looked amazing, but then over time something happened, and I want to kind of address that because you're saying screen for this stuff, and sometimes you can't screen for it. I want to kind of give people an example of how life happens, and you just kind of have to pay attention. Can you tell that story or part of it?
Yeah, so we did actually screen for the tenants, and they were a good family. They had a solid job history, and they were able to make the rent and all that stuff. And they were in for over 2 years and paid their rent faithfully. Mm-hmm. When things went wrong, they'd call us, have the water heater replaced, whatever needed. They were good tenants. And actually, I was going to be selling the property, but I chose not to because of those tenants. I didn't want to just throw them out. So that's for you investors out there. Don't make emotional decisions. They will come back and bite you. Don't be too nice. So what happened was, at one point, all of a sudden, they just stopped paying rent. And I figured, well, he maybe got laid off. Maybe there was a problem. Maybe the car broke down. They had to fix it. Things happen. So I had to be a little patient with it. And then a realtor friend of mine who worked out there called me and said, "I drove by your house. Did you know there's like a board over the front window?"
Oh, no way.
So I went out there and checked it out. Found out lawn was gone. There was the board of the window. Utilities been turned off. And the problem was that somewhere in the last few months, they had decided to see what meth was all about. Jeez. And they went down the hill fast. Wow. And pretty soon lost the job, no more paying the rent, utilities are turned off, so now there's no trash pickup, there's no water service. So, there's no electricity in the house, and they're still living there. And it was about, 4 or 5 months to go through the process to get them out. Once I got them out, 3.5 tons of garbage hauled out of that house. The 3-bedroom, 2-bath house. Wow. The stuff that was left behind there, just an absolute mess. Everything had to get gutted and redone. They had no sewage, so they just using the buckets in the closet stuff. It was just disgusting. So even your model tenants can go south on you sometimes. It's the risk of being a landlord, honestly.
Just for the audience at home, this is not a governing situation where every time you don't hear from your tenants, they're growing mad.
No.
So
this was an isolated situation. It's honestly the worst situation I ever went through. And I had a lot of rental properties, and that was the only bad experience I had, but it was a doozy.
But it still took you like 4 to 5 months to...
Oh, I think I'm still in shock cleaning up after that, yes. Yeah. But yeah, it was a mess. And then when we went to evict, the rest of the family left a lady behind. The marriage split up, all that kind of stuff. Kids got taken away. And the sheriff, when we went to the door, told me, look, if she had shown papers that she had declared bankruptcy, you could not make her leave.
Exactly.
I say, what? And you'd have to turn the utilities back on, otherwise you're slumlording it. So I said, so basically she becomes my dependent now. So pretty much.
And
that's
that's
how it
exactly
works.
what I was going to say.
Welcome to California.
There are new tricks that, hopefully it doesn't apply to most situations, but in some cases, once you think that everything is settled, you can go ahead and evict this tenant. If they file for bankruptcy, everything has to stop. And
so
you have
there's two spin-offs from this I want to talk about because it's very pertinent today and what's going on. One would be you, Tunde, with regards, that sounds very much like a business closing its doors and bailing.
Exactly.
Right? So I want to talk about that. And the other is short-term rentals, Airbnb, VRBO, that being a separate thing that everyone's getting into. I'm very excited about the concept. There's even TV shows now about how to do that kind of stuff. So I want to kind of get this. So I would like to have you answer about business.
I was going to say that as I was thinking about the commercial concerns, unfortunately we're in a pretty strong market here in Southern California for industrial projects. I'll use Class A industrial as the example. So most of the concerns actually are on the front end. How quickly can the landlord make ready the space for the company to come in and be able to utilize the space, and what penalties are associated? That typically tends to be the stress points on the front end of the lease. I unfortunately haven't been in a position where we've had a credit tenant who's in our building and on the back end they've gone out of business, and there's been a couple companies that have gone out of business in the late 2000s going into 2010.
But it can happen just like that.
So it can. So it does make it makes me aware of the fact that the language on the back end is something to negotiate and consider, because typically we're looking at the lease rate, we're looking at the term, we're looking at the credit worthiness. Are we going to get any pop on the deal, or the rent increases is going to be significant for our financials? But we're not always focused on, if they go out of business, what do we do?
So Robert, when that happens, if they just put a lock on the door and bail, who owns the content of that unit?
Well,
Are you trying to find out if you were supposed to take the meth home?
I'm talking about on the business.
On the business
because they left. They may have just. Sometimes they just abandon it. They lock the door and go.
Right.
There's desk and there's computers and there's stuff in there. Phone systems.
So I'll give you the typical lawyer answer. It depends.
Is it reasonable?
It depends on the circumstances, and usually you have a lot less protections. If it's a commercial unit, you usually have a lot less protections. So if you just abandon the property within a reasonable amount of time, you have to basically you own the contents
the
of
landlord owns the contents of the personal property and the pictures
the
that are
landlord
inside.
does. The landlord does if within a reasonable amount.
Are there specific deal points or language that you would encourage landlords to consider?
And here's what I was talking about earlier. When you have a commercial unit, you're a lot more flexible, a lot more free to sort of contract to whatever you desire, Mm-hmm. So in a commercial setting, I would encourage all of the landlords to, obviously you don't want to
address that language.
Yeah,
address
exactly.
language if you go out of business.
And you don't want to draft it, if you've been doing this for like 10, 20 years, obviously you probably already have some very good sample, lease agreements that you've once worked out with your attorney or you got from some other source.
But going dark language, having that in, and trying
the first
to
time I would definitely, I would always recommend, but especially the first time, it's very crucial to hire an attorney to put the language that you want in that contract to make sure that you're protected. I'll give you an example. Just a few months ago, I had a client. She rented this unit to open up her pharmacy in it. It was a commercial unit. And obviously there had to be some tenant improvements that had to be done on the property before she could move in and start her pharmacy. Now the language is very vague when it came to the tenant improvements. There was some language in there that for some structural stuff, only the landlord could select the contractors, right? But it didn't really define what structural meant, And all of a sudden, I have this lady who's trying to open her pharmacy contact me. Like, look, the landlord is not letting me hire anyone. He's insisting that I have to use his contractors, and his contractors are charging 2-3 times, what I found some other reputable contractors to charge. So that's so. And then, she comes to me, and I'm like, well, look, I think you have some very good facts here. We can take all the way to trial, but one, it's going to take 1 or 2 years before he'll get a decision from the courts. 2, you can end up spending tens of thousands of dollars on me, your attorney, to litigate this case. And it's so much easier if you just contract these things out. Make sure that they're envisioned and before you sign any.
Before we run out of time, I just want to touch on the short-term rental stuff because those laws are kind of different. In looking at 30-day or less rentals, talk about some of the really quick slight differences to the rules that regulate and actually protect the tenant in that situation versus long-term rentals.
So that's an evolving area of law. It's not as settled as as some of our longer rentals, but essentially.
But they have a lot less protection.
You have a lot less protection, and what you have to essentially worry about in that instance is make sure that your premises are safe. Make sure that there's no sort of like hidden defect or something like that can give rise to you being liable for any sort of injuries that can happen in that premise. So you're treated much more like as a hotel, so to speak, than you are as a long-term renter. And the other quick thing I would like to
real quick. No, we're going to get that in a second. So we're going to take a real quick commercial break. We'll be right back to talk about the rest of the short-term rental stuff at the end of the show. Thanks so much.
If you love them enough to relearn math so you can teach them math, then surely you'll check nhtsa.gov/the right seat to make sure they're correctly buckled in the back seat.
You made your house a reality. Homeschooling yourself on loans, color-coding listings, and flushing every toilet in a 20-mile radius. If you can ace house hunting, you can do it for retirement. Get on track with tips at aceyourretirement.org.
Hi, and welcome back to Real Men of Real Estate. I'm your host, Brian Fox, and we just got done talking about short-term rentals, which we're going to dive right back into and talk about the basic habitability of property that you buy so you know your tenants are secure and you have no legal issues. So, Robert, back to you. We stopped on that for a moment, but can you kind of jump back into the difference between protection under long-term and short-term rentals and how you should pursue that as an owner?
So I think the most important thing and I see these issues coming up the most when it comes to like landlord-tenant issues. It's always like, well, my unit or my apartment or my house, was not habitable. Like my hot water is not functional, or my water was not running, or things that make a place habitable, right? So back in the day, this whole concept of the warranty of the implied warranty of habitability sort of arose in a landmark case in California in 1974 called Green versus Superior Court, and that is the landmark Supreme Court case which sort of established that in California, and actually most states have something very similar, like another case that's very similar, which established that implied in every lease, no matter if the language is in the lease or not, but every landlord has a duty to offer a residential place that's habitable to their tenants, and that includes, running hot water, that includes running water, that includes, a place that's warm, a place that's habitable. And a lot of times, if cases arise, the courts look at basically codes. They look at building codes as to what defines a place habitable or not. Back in the day, before this case, before this implied warranty of habitability arose, what used to be a covenant of quiet enjoyment, and back in the day, that when a tenant got a place that was not really habitable, courts established that, okay, well, it's implied that if it's not a habitable place, then you can move out of there and your lease is over. Because of this new implied warranty of habitability case and other certain statutes all across the country, what tenants can actually do if they are faced with a situation that they're in a place that's not habitable, they can actually have several different options. They can either move out and consider the lease terminated. They can actually start doing some of the repairs themselves and abate that against rent. They can also offer less rent monthly to be commensurate with whatever condition of that unit is, or they can just keep paying normally and then just file a suit against the landlord for damages. So they have a lot more options with this relatively new case that was in the
So in this day and age, non-habitable would now include lack of free Wi-Fi and full spectrum cable. Is that right?
Yeah, it depends what speed the Wi-Fi is.
Exactly, yes.
No, they haven't taken it that far, but I don't. It's
The
not.
basic habitability is a heat source, a cooking station, a bathroom. That and then no
Flush toilet, yeah.
a toilet that flushes.
Those,
Yeah,
those
basic
are
living
ma-
conditions.
Those are basic living conditions, but obviously, when sometimes you can get into examples where it's just so dirty or something so
Right.
unsanitary that it's it's,
Rodents and insects. And those things,
Exactly.
right?
But getting called out every 15 minutes because the sink is dripping or something. I mean, those are
goes back to
Yeah.
reasonable. You
Yeah.
have to give a landlord reasonable time to first of all you have to address the issue to the landlord, and then you have to
Yeah.
give them reasonable
You
time
hate the paint.
to.
Yeah, I mean, hate the paint. The something's peeling. I hear creaking sounds when I walk, stuff like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Not relevant.
Haunted might be unhabitable.
Tunde, what we're gonna just get a couple closing thoughts from everybody as we wrap this up. Tunde, do you have anything else you can offer
A
at the
couple of
end?
things that came to mind when Robert was talking on the commercial side. I think I don't always think about habitability on the commercial industrial side. I tend to think about the plans and specifications that are going to define the space, the landlord's requirements, and then the tenant's requirements as it relates to improvements. But I did take away that big point that was mentioned earlier in terms of if a going concern that seems to be doing well, and fortunately we're in a strong economy, so we have a lot of businesses are going well. Thinking about the back end, we always
Right.
talked about the back end, what happens, and that's not always area of focus. So I really appreciated that point, and that's a key takeaway for me is that in a strong market, thinking about the back end.
And just to touch on that, I forgot to mention. So all these warranties of habitability, they do not apply to the commercial leases, only to residential leases.
Steve, anything you can wrap up with?
No, on those issues of businesses that go out, you're fortunate that you're working in a sector that is more of the logistics sectors and manufacturing, those type of things. If you think about if you're doing the retail sector, you've got restaurants that come and go all the time, the dry cleaners that come and go all the time, the little shops. Those are high turnover things, and tenants do fail. People come in, go through the little kitchen table enterprises that come in, try to set up shop, and that becomes a consistent issue for those type of landlords to deal with on the commercial side. On the residential side, I don't want to dissuade anybody from it, but as you said, you just got to do your due diligence and hope that it's good enough, and you'll never be perfect. And there's a risk in there.
So on that note, that's going to do it for us on Real Men in Real Estate. I want to tell you thank you so much for coming by. We've shared a lot of things legal when it comes to real estate. Focusing on this series is be all things protecting your mitigated risk in investing in real estate. And we talked about landlord-tenant law, habitability, items like that. Be sure to tune in for future episodes where we talk more about other items in investing. Thank you to all of our panelists and our special guests for their time on the show today. And as always, check us out on realmenofrealestate.com, Roku downloadable network, as well as Amazon Fire. We'll see you next time on Real Men of Real Estate.